One of the first questions that Shadowrun players tend to ask is, hang on, wait a minute, if this is set in our world, where are all the fantasy races coming from all of a sudden? And well, the answer is, when magic returned to the world in 2012, it turned out that the real elves were inside us all along. So you know how DNA is very complicated and there's a lot of sections of it where just nobody knows what it actually does? It's genetic information. Some of it is genetic information for things that we as humans don't have at all. It's just there. It's like having a blueprint for an airplane, and then at some point there's a page that describes a swimming pool for a hotel. They don't build that into the airplane, but the blueprint is in the folder. Not all of the genetic information that you carry is expressed, which is good because some of it is even conflicting genetic information, and which genetic information is expressed phenotypically is very complicated and very often based on a series of environmental and internal chemical factors. We don't even really understand the whole of it. But really the main changed circumstance in the world of Shadowrun at that point in time is that there is now magic. So for thousands of years, the genetic information for being a dwarf was being passed on from generation to generation because it was still in the gene pool, but it was never actually expressed, at least not to like such a great extent, because there was no magic. It was expressed sometimes in like very minor ways, like for instance, if you have a family of very short people, probably they are carrying dwarf DNA. Essentially what this means for humanity in Shadowrun is that for like actual humans, the ends of the bell curves for most of their traits have been sort of cut off, because those people now express as different metatypes. Metahumans are all still the same species though, meaning that they can usually create viable offspring. However, it will not be like a mixed metatype offspring, but it will be one of the two metatypes of the parents. So the 5 metatypes that exist in Shadowrun are dwarves, elves, humans, orcs, and trolls. But they didn't all appear at the same time. The first elvish and dwarven children were born in 2011 with adults that carried that genetic information expressing those traits later in life over the course of the following years. But 10 years later, the process of goblinization started, which is when orcs and trolls appeared. And boy oh boy, if at that point you had thought that racism against elves and dwarves was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Dwarves, known scientifically as Homo sapiens pumilionis, make up about 5% of the world's metahuman population. Though keep in mind, because there are no official worldwide numbers for how much every metatype constitutes, and it can vary vastly from region to region, these numbers are essentially just estimates. They average out at about 120 centimeters in height and have very broad, strong builds with big muscles and powerful bones. They also have mighty beards, but not the women. Genuinely, that is one of the most irritating comedic fantasy tropes to me. It is estimated that their average life expectancy is at around 100 years, though obviously they haven't been around long enough in the Shadowrun universe to confirm this, and also the fact that they have an extremely strong immune system that makes them not quite immune to toxins and diseases, but at least extremely resistant to them, probably skews those numbers a little bit also. They can also see infrared light, which is kind of cool. Kind of a subterranean adaptation. These days, they actually have a fairly positive reputation. People tend to see them as like communities of capable, diligent craftsmen that live somewhere where you're not, or maybe right under your feet. That could also happen. But of course, Shadowrun being Shadowrun and Shadowrun being quite complex, every individual will defy the expectation of what they are. Constituting about 15% of the metahuman population, Homo sapiens nobilis, better known as elves, make up the 3rd largest group of metahumans. They're a bit taller than humans, averaging out at about 190 centimeters in height, but they're also lighter, which confers them no disadvantage because their bones are denser and their muscles are stronger, and they're really just better than humans in every way imaginable. They're also incredibly smart, long-lived, very beautiful, charismatic, and they can see well in the dark. Which, you know, the Tolkien-esque elves that are just better than humans in every way trope does piss me off severely, but I also feel like it kind of fits Shadowrun as a setting very well. They are beloved and mistrusted accordingly across the board. Their charisma has opened them doors into all of the highest elite circles of power. But the fact that they can hold political office for centuries on end, probably because once again we don't know how old they can actually get, we can just estimate based on metabolic rates. Let's just say there's a lot of people who mistrust elvish politicians. There's a Sperethiel, an elvish language, and there's also two elvish nations, which is Ireland and Oregon, though they're not called those two things anymore, and they have very different philosophies. Also, fun fact, elves have a 12-month gestation period. That's just a thing. Humans, well, they're humans, you know? Homo sapiens sapiens still constitutes like 50% of the metahuman population, and though they are more centered toward their averages now, they're still the most diverse of all the metatypes. Otherwise, I mean, they're like us. They're humans. We are literally, I don't know what special things I'm going to tell you about the fantasy elements of humans. Orcs, known as Homo sapiens robustus, make up for about 25% of the world's population of metahumans, making them, after humans, the second most common metatype. Even though their life expectancy is drastically shortened, becoming adults at like 15, 16, even legally in most cases, and dying at around 50, the fact that they just have whole litters of children means that their numbers are steadily increasing. I've seen conflicting sources on this, but apparently orcs are actually a bit dumber than the average person. They have a lower IQ, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they are denied the same access to education and discriminated against socioeconomically. That's just part of their genetics. In addition to their massive frames and strong muscles, they also have tusks, which not only make him look a bit savage, but also make him speak a bit funny. But like most orcs can compensate for that. Like the elves, the orcs have their own language called Orzet, which was given to them by the mighty dragon Dunkelzahn, who was the president of the United States and Canada for like a couple hours, but that's a different story, and they've built a whole rebellious punk rock culture around it. Then you have Homo sapiens ignentes, also known as trolls, who with their 250 centimeters of height are bloody huge. They're also really broad and muscular as shit, and though their tusks tend to not be as pronounced as those of orcs, if they even have any, they do have big ol' horns on their heads and like deposits of cartilage under parts of their skin, which make them exceptionally tough. Here's an interesting thing about trolls that I remember reading somewhere, but I can't actually remember where it was. So, because of the way that the troll skull is formed, a lot of people, when they goblinized into trolls, suffered brain damage, which is why the average troll has a much lower IQ than the average metahuman. However, this apparently isn't the case for those who were born as trolls, who, unlike orcs, do not have any reduced mental capacities, and the only reason that they are, you know, down there is because, like orcs, they are heavily discriminated against. I mean, these are fearsome, hulking monstrosities that make up for about 5% of the population and who could tear you apart probably if they chose to, so people are gonna be afraid of them. So that's all the metatypes, but wait! There's more! I'm not gonna go into the metasapiens, which are like non-humans who have human-level intelligence, like for instance pixies and Sasquatches, but I will go into the metavarians. Metavarians are sort of ethnicities of metatypes. They are subgroups within those metatypes that express very differently from normal. It's not actually clear why and how exactly this happens, like this isn't written down in the rules somewhere, and I remember having a discussion about this a while ago on the Shadowcasters Discord server, and there are two big theories. One theory is that if you are a certain metatype, and if you grow up or are born within a certain kind of color of mana, which is, you know, mana of a certain area that has certain vibrations and energies to it, it might be that you express as the special metavarians. So for some reason, your parents are orcs, and they move to Japan, which is complete hypothetical because that would never happen, and then you could express as an Oni, even though neither of your parents are Onis. On the other hand, it might be just genetic. So if your parents live in Japan, they are Onis, they might move to another part of the world, and regardless of the way that the mana is there, you might still express, and probably will, as an Oni. And then of course there is the synthetic theory of the two, which says that both of the conditions need to be met. The fact of the matter is, people that are metavariant to their metatypes often are very rare, and very often have to face additional layers of discrimination. It is explicitly stated that the ones that are officially documented in the rules are not the only ones that exist, which, I mean, that's how you know, keep open to introducing like new races to your thing. It makes sense from like a design perspective. So the dwarves have 5 metavariants, and as you would expect from a company like Catalyst, not all of them have official art for them that exists anywhere at all. Gnomes are probably the most well-known of the Dwarven metavariants, even though they are extremely rare and localized only to Central Europe and some rural communities in Anatolia. With about 80 centimeters in height and about 40 centimeters in average weight, they are tiny. And though they do also lack the dwarven strength, they are extremely resistant to magic. Also, they're not as hairy as dwarves. And then you have the Haruman, who look a lot more like monkeys than they do dwarves, and who are exceptional climbers. They're named after the Indian god Hanuman, which is like a monkey incarnation of I forget which deity, and they occur exclusively in India. Some sources say that they're extremely stupid, which, I don't know, I don't like that, so I don't play it that way. Just let the monkey people be monkey people, but also dwarves. The Korobokaru are a dwarven metavariant native to the island of Hokkaido in Japan, and are mostly descended from Ainu people. They're not, like, that different from dwarves. They're just smaller, heavier, and I suppose kind of Japanese looking. They're also called Koborokaru in some of the literature, but that's a typo. Menehune are Hawaiian dwarves who are a little shorter and more heavyset on average. They're supposedly like super hairy, even though, like, because there's no official art, I've only found like one piece of art on the internet that depicts them as super hairy. But I mean, most of the time they seem to be mostly garden gnomes and stuff. Like in real life, that's the context where figures and artwork of them is used. They also have an extremely high percentage of magic users. Then there's the Querks, who live in the Ore Mountains of Saxony, and really they're just dwarves except with blue skin. Elves also have 5 metavariants. The first is the Dalakiton, which occurs on the Philippines, and they're, you know, elves with blonde hair and pale skin, which, granted, on the Philippines is actually rare. But wait! To differentiate them from just European elves, they also have no philtrum, which is sort of this crevasse underneath the nose right here, and they also have a mild allergy to spices, whatever the fuck that is. Not only are those the 2 most random things that you could come up with, you know how different spices are from each other? How they have nothing in common? This is like tree bark. That's what cinnamon is. And then you have spices that are just leaves. You have spices that are just rocks. I just love the mental image of them getting a rash because you throw like a handful of fucking Old Bay at them. That is unreasonably funny to me. Dryads are physically shorter than the average elf, being more around the ballpark of humans. They're also much more slender and graceful, you might say, and they're very heavily influenced by their environment. Like, not just mentally by the people around them, but physically by the physical things of where they live. They can occur anywhere in the world, which makes them pretty unique as far as metatypes go. So the thing is that in 2nd edition Shadowrun, they used to just be like wood elves who would change colors as the seasons passed. But in 5th edition, they changed all that, and now they are basically products of their environment. They were also posited to be exclusively female, which I don't know if that's the case in 5th edition anymore. I don't think they really say it anywhere, and I think it's cool, you know, whatever way you like to play it, but I do in general prefer the 5th edition ones because they give you more options with your individual character. Then you have the Night Ones, also known as Nocturni, who are native to Western Europe and can be found especially commonly in Pomoria. And the big difference is that they have like dark, short fur. Communities of them can be found all over the world though, and it does appear as though they're adapted to living at night because that is how their natural circadian rhythm goes, and they're also a bit allergic to sunlight. Then you have the Wakyambi, who are not just black elves, as some people will tell you, though they do have dark skin and do live mostly in Africa. So you know how elves are tall and thin? Well, Wakyambi are tall and gangly. Seriously, some of them get larger than trolls, easily. And you know, elves are sort of revered around the world as one of the few metatypes that actually did make it, but Wakyambi in Africa, in most areas, are almost worshipped as gods, which does lead to a lot of black elves just sort of pretending like they're Wakyambi. Which, you know, humans posing as other metatypes is something that happens also. Then you have the ones that are called this. They're extremely short and they live very isolated in tribes deep in the Amazon rainforest, not really caring much about the outside world. So that art over there, I just googled green elf. Because that's the closest approximation that I could find to it. But really, they're described as only having green spots in their skin, which are apparently or are not made of like chlorophyll. And also, they probably have Native American features considering where they live. I mean, just imagine Wizards of the Coast coming out with a new D&D subrace, and just there is no artwork for it. They just get no artwork produced for it at all. Humans have one officially documented metavariant, and that is the Nartaki. So the Nartaki was actually a very recent metavariant. It only started occurring in 2061, the year of the comet, where just a lot of weird shit happened to a lot of people because the amount of mana in the world drastically increased. They appeared pretty much exclusively in India and are highly venerated by a big subset of the population. But, you know, them having been mostly just regular people before that, not all of them are very happy with, like, being worshipped as gods. I mean, imagine you're just an accountant, just some dude who likes to play Modern Warfare in the evenings. And then suddenly you get 2 extra arms and your skin turns blue or red or gold. And people start thinking you're some kind of deity. That has to be a bit traumatic. The orcs have 4 metavariants. Hobgoblins are really just kind of larger fantasy goblins, making them about human size and stature. They have sharp teeth, pointy ears, a hooked nose, and kind of greenish skin. They can be found mostly in the Arab world, where they face huge amounts of discrimination, in addition to the discrimination that metahumans face there anyway. It does actually turn out though, and I love this so much, is that they do have a bigger tendency to engage in antisocial behaviors just inbuilt, because their bodies produce way more stress hormones and they get super angry super quick. Ogres do tend to be a bit shorter than regular orcs, but the fact that they are so much broader and that their, you know, center of gravity is so much lower makes them almost impossible to wrestle. Like hobgoblins, they also have a little bit of a greenish tone to their skin, and their face is also different, mostly being like very sharp featured and big boned. Although, or perhaps because they can eat pretty much anything that isn't straight up poison or chemical waste, they do tend to get like fat quite quickly. Oni are Japanese horned orcs, and if you know anything about Japan in Shadowrun, is that they're very racist over there. It actually turns out, and this is interesting, there's a big anomaly that 3/4 of the orcish population in Japan is actually Oni, which you still don't want to be Oni, but it's probably best to be an Oni of all of the metatypes and metavariants that you can be. They have horns, glowing eyes, and skin that can actually be a whole array of colors, but usually is just kept to like one very strong one, like red, or, you know, ultramarine dark blue, and they are a bit slimmer than regular orcs. They're also much more likely than average to be magically gifted. Satyrs or satyrs, depending on which part of the world you come from, are horned and hoofed as a metavariant, and though originating in Greece, can now be found all over the world. They do seem to have an inborn need to experience new things. They tend to be very outgoing and extroverted, very experimental, do a lot of drugs, very charismatic also, and supremely interested in especially the performing arts. They are much hairier than regular orcs, but are also seen as generally more attractive, So make of that what you will. Trolls, like orcs, have 4 metavariants. Cyclops are native to Greece but can be found all over the Mediterranean. They are much more muscular than regular trolls, which are already impressive in that department, and only have both 1 eye and 1 horn. This does of course mess with their depth perception a little bit. However, being this hulking, massive power machine that can throw anyone around like a ragdoll does kind of compensate for that a little bit. Fomori can be found all over the British Isles, though primarily they live in Tir na Nog, which is Ireland. They are both shorter and weaker than regular trolls, bringing them down to about human bodybuilder level, but they're also a lot less weird looking, and some are actually considered quite handsome. And they are also very often magically gifted. Do not confuse Fomori with Fomorians. That's a different thing. Those are essentially troll werewolves infected with the Yarka strand of the human metahuman vampiric virus. Yeah, there's like 3.5 kinds of vampire virus in Shadowrun. I'll do a video on them eventually. Then we have the Giant, which intuitively, they're big. And I'm talking like really big. Like average height of 3 meters big. They live in rural communities in Scandinavia and the Baltic states and have this sort of Aryan, blonde hair, blue eyes comic book look, except for they have big noses also. They also lack horns and tusks and cartilage under their skin completely. They are genuinely almost as isolated as the Elvish people, the name where I'm not even gonna try to pronounce, but you know the ones from the Amazon, but mostly due to discrimination. And here's something that I found on the German Shadowrun wiki, which I was not able to corroborate anywhere, because it might be like a fan thing that sometimes happens on that wiki, which is why it's so much better than the English Shadowrun wikis. So essentially something that happens is that 2 non-human metahumans will have a child and it will turn out human. And apparently this happens with giants more often than any metatype or metavariant. Then, last but not least, we have the Minotaurs, who not only have really big horns, but also massive necks. I mean, they are after all kind of half bull, so. Unlike with regular trolls, whose horns usually grow out of this part of the head, they grow out of this part of the head. I love just not having to know the words for things because I do video. Although they are centered around Greece, they are actually fairly widely distributed, so they can be found in the Balkans and in the western parts of the Middle East, even in Ukraine sometimes. So that is the metavariants of Shadowrun, and I didn't even get into all of them as deep as I could have, not just because the material is very often spotty, which it is, but also because I'm not necessarily what you might call a lore purist. I mean, if you don't even feel the need to put actual artwork for all your races into your books, I kind of feel entitled as a player and as a GM to have my players be able to play the metavariants and really even the metatypes however way they want. I mean, this is my general approach to Shadowrun, but I especially do this with metatypes. Here's an interesting question that I have for you people watching the video right now, and I'm genuinely very curious about this stuff, right? If in your area where you live, right, there was Shadowrun and like metahumans, what kind of metavariants would there be like your local metavariant sphere? What are like your local legends of peoples, and what metatype would they probably be a part of? I'm genuinely like excited to see the responses to that in the comments. Thank you very much for watching this new Shadowrun lore video. It's been they're coming out with a fairly high frequency now, I feel like. A lot of the fans are going to be very happy about that. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the things, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection, or maybe supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. And in that spirit, genuinely give me that information in the comments. Think that I have you at gunpoint because I want to know. And see you around, cunts.